Well, good morning, everyone. It is really good to see you and to be together to worship our Lord Jesus and to dig deeply into His Word. And I just want to give a shout out to those of you who are worshiping with us online. We just want you to know we highly value our GHC online campus, and we're so thankful that even though it's not possible for you to be here with us in person, we really appreciate and enjoy the fact that you are a part of this church, and we are just so thankful that we are able to do that to worship this morning. So I'm guessing that if we're all honest, we would come to the point where we realize there's some burden that bothers most of us. It's a burden that we feel for something or someone or a cause that the Lord has really laid on our heart, and we just feel like we should do something about it, but maybe we're hesitant, we're not really sure how to proceed, but somewhere or other there's something that God has put on our heart. And we really hope that as we're studying through Nehemiah, that's exactly what's beginning to take place in your heart and your life today. The burden that you bear often reveals the calling that you'll embrace. That pretty much is the whole bottom line of the good work that we are called to do. I can think of so many people, and we've tried to highlight them throughout this last month, that are part of the GHC family who've sensed a burden from God and a calling to do a good work. And they not only have that burden, but they've acted on that passion, and they are and continue to be involved in doing that good work. This past week, one of our own members, Dr. Jillian Carden, at a gathering together called Fort Knox Partners, she's the executive director for Silverleaf, and she was honored as a gold neighbor for her good work. And she truly is a testament to this whole idea and subject of having a burden from God and acting on that and doing something and making a difference. She cares deeply for those who are traumatized by sexual abuse and violence, and she leads a tremendous organization called Silverleaf that reaches hundreds of people every single year right here in our own community by providing counseling and support to help them deal with the issue and recover from such a horrible issue and to live with that even in the midst of what that does to them. What's really awesome is that Jillian is a Christ follower. She loves Jesus with all of her heart, and she understands that this job is far more than that. It truly is, in her life, a calling from the Lord, and she never hesitates to give glory to Him on how He is involved intimately in the details and the process of that restoration that happens in people's lives. And the point's this: she had a burden. She truly did. She, you might say, sat down to cry, she kneeled to pray, and she stood up and acted. I remember that time when she was considering taking on this job because it meant a big transition for her, but she really sensed this was far more than a job. It truly was a calling, and nothing to the contrary has been proven over the last few years as she's led that. And she's making a big difference, and her staff is working to make a big difference in our community by doing this good work. So back to Nehemiah, this average, ordinary guy who had no real position or authority, but he had a passionate burden from the Lord, and he stood up to act. He did the good work, and he made a huge difference in the lives of the people in Jerusalem and in the history of Israel. So let's just recap. If you happen to be joining with us today in the first of this series, let's understand where we are in the history of Israel is that in 587 BC, the Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, invaded and destroyed Jerusalem. And for the first time, the temple and the walls of Jerusalem were torn down and burned. And after living in captivity for 140 years, 7 generations later, many of the people of Israel who had been exiled during that overtaking by the Babylonians are now still living in the land of captivity. Some of them, however, have migrated back and are living in the ruins, so to speak, of Jerusalem itself. Nehemiah learns of this, and he's deeply convicted. 140 years after the event, 7 generations later, we want to remind and emphasize that fact. He gets a burden for what is happening in Jerusalem, and he feels called to lead an effort to rebuild the wall and provide the providence of God. And through all of that, he is able to find the king of Persia, King Artaxerxes agrees not only to let Nehemiah go do this, but to provide all of the resources and the protection and the permission that he needs. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, that I can rebuild it. That was the burden that was on his heart. You might say he realized someone must do the work. It might as well be me. It's not a bad way to consider the things that the Lord lays on your heart, folks. So this, not a pastor, or priest, or appointed position of leadership, ordinary guy gathers his resources together and he does the good work. So you might ask yourself, well, as I think about how that applies to me, what's the process? Is there a process that Nehemiah went through to actually pray about, plan for, and do this work? And there really is. And when you read the book of Nehemiah, as I hope you are doing, you'll see that there truly is a process that he walks through to make this happen. And not surprisingly, the first thing he does is pray. He begins to seek God faithfully. Let's jump in again back into the story. And it's from Nehemiah chapter 2. I want to read verses 1 and 2 and then the first part of verse 4. It says, early in the following spring, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence. So the king asked me, why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled. Then the king asked, well, how can I help you? With a prayer to the God of heaven. Let's just stop right there for a moment. Nehemiah knows the importance of prayer and that that's where he needs to start. Truth, in all of Nehemiah, no less than 12 times do we see Nehemiah, before he speaks or before he acts, he prays. In his heart, he prays and asks the Lord for direction and for wisdom. Why? Because he understands the importance for that. I love this prayer because this is what I think it's a very simple and short, what you might call an inhale, exhale prayer of the heart. Nobody hears it. It's just the Lord and Nehemiah. And he's asked this question, and he knows this is a big moment. He knows he's got to get it right. He knows he has this opportunity before the king of Persia to share the vision and get what he needs. And so it's almost like, you know how when you're asked a big question, and before you answer, you just kind of pause and breathe, and then you speak. That's literally what you're seeing right here. That's a great time to pray. Lord God, give me the wisdom to say the right thing. It's an inhale, exhale prayer of the heart. Before he speaks, he prays. And nobody but God and Nehemiah hears that prayer. Why? Because he realizes the breadth of what he's about to do. All of this plan, it cannot happen without the help and the power of God, working in and through every aspect of this project. Nehemiah knew full well that it had to be from God. See, when it comes to prayer, nothing's too big for God's power or too small for God's heart. Nothing is too big for him to do. Literally nothing. Sometimes people don't pray because they think, I don't want to bother God with that. Well, nothing's too small either. Prayer is all about going before the throne of God in confidence to share what the burdens are on our heart. You know, if prayer isn't necessary to accomplish your vision, then maybe you're not thinking big enough. Consider this. Our work for God should be of a caliber that it's so big that without God it will fail. I mean, it's so big that if we just try to do it in our own power and ability, it's going to fall flat on its face and it's going to fail. And then when it does happen, when it is successful and when it takes place, it'll be so big that not you or no person or no group can step back and take credit for it. Because it was obvious that because that happened, it had to be by the power and the presence and the resources of God. That's when prayer needs to be involved. So what is your passion? What are you praying for? What are you sensing, maybe throughout this series or before this, and this is kind of tapping into it, that God's continuing to lay on your heart to drive you, to call you, to fill your heart with passion? What is that? And are you praying? Or are you just trying to figure this out from a human perspective? Do some praying, lay it in his hands, and watch what he does. Because when we step forward into this narrative, what we begin to see is how God lays everything out for Nehemiah. He prayed, and then when the opportunity was presented, he spoke very clearly the vision that God had been laying on his heart to share with the king and with others. He was very simple, he was direct, and he was clear with his vision. So kneel, seek God in prayer for that burden, but then when it comes time to speak the vision, speak it clearly. It's so important that we define our vision clearly when we understand what God is saying. Look at verse 5. He is so spot on and clear with this. He says, if it pleases the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. That is the whole vision in basically one sentence. It's concise, it's direct, it's clear, and it's incredibly powerful. And King Artaxerxes doesn't have to read between the lines to try and figure out what it is Nehemiah wants. You know, when you know your calling, you need to define it clearly. When you wrap your head around the burden that God's placed on your heart, you need to define it. It's, you know, you don't see any sense in Nehemiah where it's like, well, you know, like it's kind of like, you know, there's these people, some of them I'm related to, that, you know, they're in trouble. And I thought maybe I might just come to you, and maybe if I mentioned it to you, well, I don't know, maybe you could sort of help a little bit, and maybe there's some, you get none of that. My relatives are in need, and I need to go share I need to go rebuild the wall. He makes it even clearer than I can say to you. He states it simply and clearly. If it pleases the king, if you're pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. Boom, that's it. Clarity conveys passion and your heart of commitment towards a project. You know, it's often not a lack of caring, but a lack of clarity that becomes a problem. In my years of working with National Prayer Committee over the last 20 years, literally, I've encountered a whole lot of people from all over the country who have some visions in their heart and mind. And I've sat in meeting after meeting after meeting when, for the first time, they've tried to convey that vision. And there are so many times, about 15 minutes into the vision, my OCD, ADD kicks in, and I just want to say, stop talking right now, boil it down to one sentence, and come back when you're ready. Because there's nothing that frustrates you when you really are passionate about what God's doing in people's hearts and you want to help. But if it's not clear, it's just like, I don't know, I'm not on board. I'm not jumping on with that. I mean, Nehemiah nailed it the first time. And Artaxerxes is like, okay, let's make this happen. You need to understand. Let's say it's something about children in need. Well, which ones do we help first? Those who are hungry, those who are abused, those who are homeless, those who need help with supplies for school, or like we're coming up on here in our own time period. You know, well, which specific area of need do you want to help with? And where do I help? Is it here? Is it in my own city? Is it in my community? Is it in the state? Is it in the nation? Or is it overseas somewhere? Where is it you want to go? And what does it even mean to help? Is it medical? Is it education? Is it food? Let's do understand this, that as Christ followers, wherever, to whomever, and in whatever area we're going to provide help, it always needs to be about the gospel. We don't just meet these needs just so we can present the gospel, but we help them understand that part of the gospel is meeting these needs. And it's always about Jesus. No matter what it is that our calling or our burden is, where God brings us and helps us, it's always about exalting Jesus and giving and helping and being a part of the opportunity for the transforming power of Jesus to change their life and their situation. But the bottom line is this: if you're not clear on your passion and calling, it's going to impact your ability to accomplishment. If you can't define it, you can't do it. So begin to understand the specifics of that. Sometimes a vision and a passion requires time for this clarity. Do understand that. You realize from the moment that the news was shared with Nehemiah and he sat down to cry, he kneeled to pray, and he stood up to act, was a 4-month process. For 4 months, he prayed, he cried, he fasted, he sought the wisdom of God. 4 months before he then, in the presence of the king, spoke this amazingly clear vision. That's how long it took for him to be certain about what it was. So don't hesitate to take the time to do that. Prayer is a part of that. This ongoing conversation with Jesus about what you sense him calling you to do. Research it. Study the situation and the need and what's required of that. Seek the counsel of others. I refer back to Jillian. When Jillian was considering stepping into Silverleaf, she came, she talked, she prayed. We prayed together and thought, is this exactly? But it wasn't just me. She sought her mom and her husband and others because it was such a big deal. Take the time to research what it is God's calling to you. Get the counsel of others who've maybe walked that road. And if you need to seek training, seek some training. All of that is part of understanding what it takes to accomplish this. Again, not only what God is burdening you, but what's God leading you to do? Well, where are you in this process? So define the vision carefully, and then make some plans. Make the plans carefully. I want to jump back into Nehemiah. We're going to jump ahead in chapter 2, but look at verses 6 through 8 and see how this begins to come together. The king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked, "How long will you be gone? When will you return?" And after I told him how long I'd be gone, the king agreed to my request. I also said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, instructing them to let me travel safely through their territories on my way to Judah. And please give me a letter addressed to Asaph, the manager of the king's forest, instructing him to give me timber. I will need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress, for the city walls, and for a house for myself." And the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. So he understood the vision. I need to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. And he had a plan. I'm going to need protection along the way, king. I'm going to need providence. I'm going to need the resources to make this happen, the timber and the wood. And I'm going to need money to pull all of this together. He made some very careful plans. You know, a goal without a plan is just a wish. It's a nice wish. It may be a good wish. But when there's not a plan that's put together, it's not going to happen. He knew what it would require, all of those things. And so not only was he able to articulate a very defined, clear vision, he had a plan put together to say, this is what I'm going to need, king, to make it happen. Now, the plan doesn't need to be perfect. They never really are. Plans are a good thing to have in place to get us started. But along the way, sometimes we have to make some adjustments to those plans. But you need a plan to get started, and he had one. But just make the best possible plan with the information available, and then begin. How do you begin? You do the next right thing. You do the next right thing. That is so clear in what Nehemiah did here. Remember that when it comes to executing the plans of God and the calling of God in your life, you are on a need-to-know basis. Nehemiah knew the vision, and he made a plan with everything that he had, but you will see as this narrative carries out, the details unfolded as the work unfolded. God continued to reveal to Nehemiah the next step. So where do you start? The next best and the next good step. That's where you begin the plan. You trust the Lord in that process for unfolding wisdom along the way, for the necessary protection that it's going to take to accomplish it, and for adequate provision and resources. That is all through this letter of Nehemiah, and it is all through the work of God that we continue to see in people today, in the church and in the community. When people hear and sense a defined calling and burden from the Lord, and they step into it, they begin that process of letting God unfold the plan. It's not always a detailed plan. Sometimes it's a good thing that the Lord doesn't give us the whole plan at the beginning, because we would look at it and say, no, not going to go there. And we're going to cover that part of the plan as we move on, when Nehemiah and his team face some serious opposition. We're going to really get into that next week. But right now, it's just the process of starting by doing the next right thing. And he does that. He shares the vision. He gets the answers. He gets the resources because of the favor of God. And then he steps out. He goes to Jerusalem. He ventures there. He gets there. And when he's in Jerusalem, he starts to survey the area around. He gets up in the middle of the night, literally, when no one else can see him. And he gets on a donkey and he walks out. He goes outside and he walks around the city gates so he can just visualize. He had the plan in his head, but once he got on site, he took a look and he began to get the breadth of the whole situation. And then the next move was when he came back that next morning. Not knowing why he was there and what he was up to, he gathered together all of the leaders that were there in Jerusalem. Because these people had come back, they had set up, and a leadership had developed within Jerusalem. He gathered all of the leaders together, and he began to share with them. So he defined a vision, he made a plan, and then he inspired the people that were there to passionately jump on board with him. Let's jump over later on in chapter 2. I want to jump to verse 16. It says, "The city officials did not know that I had been out there or what I was doing, for I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans. I had not yet spoken to the Jewish leaders, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or anyone else in the administration." Okay, so that's who's at the table right now, all right? And here's what he says. "But now I said to them, you know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace." Then I told them about the gracious hand of God, how the gracious hand of God had been on me, and about my conversation with the king. Think for a moment about the power of sharing what God had already done up to this point. When Nehemiah says, I went to King Artaxerxes, and all these guys are thinking, he's the king of Persia. Persia's who destroyed our city 140 years ago, or Babylon, which is now Persia at that point in time. And here we are in the midst of that. And so what you're saying to us, Nehemiah, is Artaxerxes, the king of the nation that destroyed us, is going to provide passage, protection, resources, and money to rebuild these things? Oh yeah, let's do it. We're on board. He inspired them with passion to what it was. Nehemiah's burden was so obvious that the king could see it on his face. He could see the trouble in his face, and he became the vessel of God. He inspired these leaders of Jerusalem because they immediately saw what he was wanting to do and what he was willing to do and what he had already done to get to this point. When people get inspired by a clear, powerful vision from God and a burden to do a good work and to make a difference, some things begin to happen to them. They have faith that God is for them. And these leaders needed to know without question that God was for them in this, because this was no little deal. As we'll see next week, once the work starts, the opposition begins. And they knew full well that's what would happen. They knew that God was for them. When people begin to see that God's working in you and you inspire them to come alongside in either that work or their own work, they see that God was with you and the faith begins to build in them. Yeah, God is for us. They trust that God's with them. They sense His presence. Not just the theological truth. We know from a theological standpoint that God is always with us. But sometimes it's good to sense that, right? It's good to feel that presence. We all know He's here. But man, when we sense that presence, when He shows up, we use that verbiage a lot, when He shows up and we sense it, wow, it really begins to impact our heart. So inspired people have faith that God's for them, they trust that He's with them, and they believe that God will empower them to do something that matters and that it will make a difference. They're literally on fire with passion to do what God calls them. A long time ago, John Wesley, the traveling missionary and preacher who is the father of the Methodist movement, said this incredible quote. He said, "Light yourself on fire with passion, and people will come from miles to watch you burn." Don't do it literally, but let the passion burn inside you. I mean, people respond to passion. I mean, why should I be passionate about something that you're not passionate about? Inspired people believe this truth, that God will do a good work through them. And they believe the truth of Ephesians 3:20. Now to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than anything you can ask or anything you could imagine, with His power that is at work in you. They believe that. See, the burden that you bear often reveals the difference that you're going to make. So, to tie a bow on this today, what a great example we've had this past week as the Grace Heartland Student Ministry followed God's call on them to go to Rockcastle County, Kentucky, and to minister to some people who had been deeply impacted by the floods that were in that area. And they saw a need, they prayed about it, they shared a vision, they made a plan, and they did a good work, and they made a difference. Let's watch this.
Student mission trips are so important for two reasons. First is that these families that we're coming to help really do need flood relief or leaky roofs repaired, unsafe floors repaired, and our students are really able to make their homes safe and livable in 1 week's time. And the other side is of that equation is that they're life-changing for students. They truly do unlock something in a student that realizes God can use them to reach out to someone in Jesus' name.
It's really good to just take a break from everything and help people out, and then also God always finds a way to just speak to you through the week, and that's just a great thing to take away from these mission trips.
Well, my group this week, we were replacing a shingle roof with a new metal roof for this older woman, and obviously I couldn't have done that by myself, and it was something that I obviously didn't have the skills or the knowledge to do, but with the help of my team, we've been able to come a long way and help her out.
Mission trips are something that takes a ton of specific planning so that when you actually go to do it, things are as fruitful as they can possibly be. And so we work daily for months to make sure that God can accomplish everything He possibly is able to squeeze out of us in 5, 6, 7 days.
We were building the deck, and when we first got there at the beginning of the week, the staircase they had, we could just pull off. It was rotted and just old and very unsafe, and being able to be there and build that whole deck for them, which is set in concrete and super sturdy and brand new, and seeing them able to walk on it and see them have that something new, that was super cool. So I would just encourage everyone to do the work, because you would have no idea the benefits that can come out of it once you actually finish it.
It's really important to stretch ourselves. We've talked a lot about that this week, and there's definitely been opportunities to stretch throughout this week, but I think that every opportunity that we can have to put in some work for another person and just show them God's grace, I think that it's really important to do that.